ebreo di sangue, hamburghese di cuore, d'anima fiorentino, Jewish by blood, Hamburgian at heart, a Florentine soul.
My grandfather was born in Hamburg in 1866, and he was the eldest of 7 children, 2 girls and 5 boys, and grew up in Hamburg. It was a liberal Jewish family. The early photographs show him as probably a rather smug little boy with a great high hairstyle, very dark-skinned compared to his colleagues at school. You know, most of those were proper Germans, as it were.
The Warburg family had established itself in Altona, adjacent to Hamburg, in the late 17th century. Their bank rose to national and international prominence.
Aby was the oldest, so Aby should have inherited the bank of Warburg. That was his birthright. He wasn't, I think, a particularly well child. He was always more interested in books than in money. And the story goes that when he was 13 and Max was 12, they made a pact that Max could have the bank if Aby was allowed to have as much money as he wanted for his books. And allegedly, Max thought hard. Books, yes. Goethe, Schiller, Lessing, Heine. We probably want some thrillers and so on as well, but we should be able to afford that out of the bank. And they agreed this at the ages of 13 and 12, stuck to it all their lives, and apparently, long afterwards, Max said it was the most expensive blank cheque that he'd ever written.
In 1886, Warburg enrolls as a student at the University of Bonn, studying philology, art history, archaeology, and philosophy. He expresses concern about his identity as a Jew and decides to no longer keep kosher, to the consternation of his parents.
26th January 1887, Dear Mama, I'm not at all ashamed to be a Jew. On the contrary, I'm trying to show others that representatives of my kind are well suited, in accordance with their talents, to insert themselves as useful links in the chain of present-day developments of culture and the state. But precisely because I want to do that, I must arrive to shake off whatever will not fit organically into my activity. I want to act as I am. I want to be regarded by people as I am.
He continues his studies in art history at the University of Strasbourg.
25 November 1889. Dear Mama, the people here are absolutely ghastly. I can't leave the house during the day without someone saying behind me, look, that's a Jew.
Warburg goes on to spend several months in Florence, working on his dissertation on Botticelli. There he meets Mary Hertz, an artist with whom he falls in love. She was from a distinguished Gentile family from Hamburg. Both their parents object to their relationship. A German patriot, Warburg serves 1-year military service in the horse artillery, which he rather likes. It helps keep his anxieties at bay. At 27, he is released from the army. Ambivalent about his scholarly pursuits, and with no career plans, he goes back to Florence. In his diaries, Warburg speaks of depression and lost time. He returns to his study of the Italian Renaissance and explores the afterlife of antiquity.
to show how Sandro Botticelli dealt with contemporary views of antiquity as a force that demanded resistance or submission has formed the purpose of this inquiry.
Warburg was interested in how antiquity survives, whereas most of the antique that people looked at as surviving was the world of beauty and the world of composure and order. Warburg was interested in the survival not only of that, but also of another kind of antiquity, an antiquity that was characterized by passion, by losing oneself, by falling into the pathos of the moment, the movement of the moment.
Exuberant vitality, the awareness of germinating, creative will to life, and an unspoken, maybe an unconscious opposition to the strict discipline of the Church, demand an outlet for the accumulated pent-up energy in the form of expressive movement. And thus, a diligent search begins in the permitted sacred story for a pretext, after which the classical past must lend its protective, indisputable authority as a precedent to allow the search for freedom of expression, if not in words, then at least in pictorial form. It is possible to trace, step by step, how the artists and their advisors recognized the antique as a model that demanded an intensification of outward movement, and how they turned to antique sources wherever accessory forms, those of garments and of hair, were to be represented in motion. The entire range of emotional stirrings, aggression, defense, sacrifice, mourning, melancholia, ecstasy, triumph, etc., is expressed through the revival of movements, gestures and postures, that is Pathos-Formel, the expressive formulas of emotion, either taken from ancient modes or reappearing as mnemonic traces in successive works. It may be added that this evidence has its value for psychological aesthetics in that it enables us to observe, within a milieu of working artists, an emerging sense of the aesthetic act of empathy as a determinant of style.
He finds the beautiful painting, and then he finds something that just doesn't fit. A staid, static representation of real human beings at the time is suddenly interrupted by this amazing figure who he calls Nympha, racing through. Not only from another style, but from another era. She's from a classical antiquity.
This is certainly part of this idea for the revival of antiquity, survival, revival, afterlife, whatever we want to use as an English term to translate Nachleben. It is perhaps the nucleus of this idea to devote all his studies to the afterlife of antiquity.
The Nympha is, of course, one of these figurations that appears throughout decades and centuries, always in a way that we recognize the figure, but it's always transformed. It's never identical, but its impulse and its impact is the same.
Warburg's interest in movement and gesture leads him to also write about a broad range of subjects, including pageants, theatrical costume, and even stamps.
From his early youth, he loved to collect stamps. And he said if all the images which are around us would have been lost, an album of stamps would help us to understand the world. We learn from these global graphics a lot about civilization, different cultures, and so on.
He's very interested in culture in all its manifestations in different parts of the world, so he's the first, in a way, global Kultur interpreter.
Kulturwissenschaft, what is that? Cultural science. Bringing together different disciplines, mostly based on the use of images, but also in words, in texts, and other practices.
The crucial influences for Warburg's undertaking would be Jakob Burckhardt's way of writing history, which was to write a history of the whole culture of the Renaissance, for example, which meant not just paintings and literature, but it was about festive culture, about the cultures of jokes, about letter writing, about dandies and elegance.
He began his work on his dissertation for Botticelli after his studies with the philologist Usner, who took philology in the direction of anthropology and folklore.
He included in his study of images the study of religion, philology. He really widened the field. He was reading the current publications of anthropologists, psychologists, also biologists of his time.
Warburg was indeed a very avid reader of Darwin's expression of the emotions in man and animals. We see these expressions of emotion across cultures, the similar things, throwing out their hands. Melancholia 1 by Dürer, this expression of thoughtful reflection, we find it through history, and it's not because one is copying another, because that's what we do when we reflect.
To use the methods which the sciences are using. That is what he thought rationalizes the study of art in a way of distancing it from aesthetics.
For art is not only something which is aesthetic relevant, but it's relevant in so many other dimensions too, culturally and intellectually, and there's a lot of knowledge enclosed within the artworks.
I had developed a downright disgust with aestheticizing art history, the formal contemplation of images not conceived as a biologically necessary product situated between the practices of religion and art seemed to me to give rise to such a sterile trafficking in words.
In 1895, Warburg takes a trip to the United States for the marriage of his brother Paul with Nina Loeb. Paul would become a founder of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. Nina came from an influential German Jewish family of financiers. Warburg notes his horror at urban America.
Telegram and telephone destroy the cosmos. Mythical and symbolic thinking strives to form spiritual bonds between humanity and the surrounding world, shaping distance into the space required for devotion and reflection, the distance undone by the instantaneous electrical connection. The emptiness of civilization on the east coast of America repelled me so much that I simply chanced a flight to real objects and to scientific pursuits by going to Washington to visit the Smithsonian Institution. There I met Cyrus Adler and James Mooney, and Franz Boas in New York, pioneers of native research who opened my eyes to the worldwide importance of prehistoric and wild America. Hence I decided to visit Western America both as a modern creation and in its lower Hispano-Indian strata. An urge towards the romantic must be added, a desire for a somewhat more manly activity than had been granted me so far.
Warburg takes a trip to Pueblo country. He takes many photographs with his newly acquired Kodak camera and draws pictures and diagrams in his notebook. Warburg visits Zuni villages in New Mexico and travels to the Walpi and Orabi villages in the Black Mesa. He observes Hopi culture, visits a kiva, a sacred space, and witnesses the Hemiskachina ancestral spirit dance. Warburg is particularly interested in the Hopi snake dance, a ritual in which priests place poisonous snakes in their mouths before casting them out into the desert, with the hope that they deliver their prayers for rain to the underworld, the land of their ancestors. Warburg never gets to see the ceremony, but studies it through photographs.
The link between pagan religious ideas and artistic activity is nowhere better to be seen than with the Pueblo Indians, and one could find in their culture rich material for an inquiry into the origins of symbolic art.
When he gets to America and he goes to the Pueblo dances, he can't stop himself from going on about how wonderful these ritual practices are. He had a kind of admiration for orchestrated festivities, practices, and so on. In his slightly romanticized view, I think that Warburg saw too much that was significant for his studies in the Pueblo tribe and overlooked their own sort of political and religious contexts.
Warburg returns to Germany, and early in 1897, he gives 3 lectures on his trip to the Southwest. Warburg later writes to James Mooney of the Smithsonian Institution,
I always feel myself very much indebted to your Indians. Without the study of their primitive civilization, I never would have been able to find a larger basis for the psychology of the Renaissance.
He found that key about what cultures do as cultures when he visited the Hopi Indians in America. It was not only a vision of culture that he learned among the Hopi, where culture is always in an embattled state against forces of nature and forces inside the person and outside the person that are dangerous, but also that these fights, these struggles out of which culture emerges are universal ones.
A.B. Warburg and Mary Hertz marry in October 1897, 10 years after they met.
Great opposition from his family, who really didn't like the idea of his marrying a Gentile, but he was a pretty cussed person, a pretty determined person, and they did get married. They lived in Italy for several years in Florence, and she very much supported his work there. I mean, to some extent, she became almost his amanuensis. And it seems to have been a very happy time on the whole. But I've also read that he suffered from depressions.
They have 3 children, Marietta, Max Adolf, and Friede.
They were not brought up Jewish, although I think he took them to Passover. He didn't go to his father's funeral and refused to say the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead.
In 1902, Warburg and his family moved to Hamburg. He continues to collect books with an idea of forming a private library. The city of Hamburg, large, prosperous, and progressive, had an old established tradition of learning. Wealthy Jews were actively engaged in education, culture, and civics.
Where the other brothers and the bank were giving money, he was providing something else for the city and for Germany. A.B. then came to regard himself as a cultural banker, and that in itself fitted in with the Jewish idea of philanthropy in which the Warburgs were very much involved in Hamburg. He expected them to go on funding him, and there are some quite cross letters where he's demanding more. They seem to have tolerated this, and I think they appreciated what he was trying to do. He did once say, "I'm quite certain that my library will survive Warburg, the bank."
Warburg notes in his diary,
I discussed with Max the idea of a Warburg library for the science of culture. He was not against it.
He writes to Max,
30 June 1900. I'm really a fool for not insisting even more that we should demonstrate by our example that capitalism is also capable of intellectual achievements of a scope which would not be possible otherwise. 14 July 1900. The knowledge of having a free hand with respect to book purchases invigorates me and my research, because it enables me freely to explore the three directions of literature, art, and political history. 28 October 1900. Again and again, I stupidly cease to believe in the profitability of my gifts, and thus occasionally act the little clerk and modest professor, instead of moving with that boldness in economic matters that befits the financially independent private scholar. From time to time, my physical ailments enhance this moral weakness. You, as practically minded and far-sighted merchants, should really encourage me to be ruthless in my purchases. I need encouragement, then the rest also works. Hence I should like as soon as possible to find a form for the transfer of library expenses. Have you thought about it any more? Other rich families have a horse stable. You have my library. And that is more, because those who accumulate material goods must also do something for the development of the mind. Beyond the aggrandizement of the family name, it is a rational investment.
A.B. Warburg associates his own rich banking family in Hamburg with the wealthy Florentine patrons of the Renaissance. He intended them to play a similar role in cultural patronage to that which had been played by the Medici, Sassetti, and Tornabuoni fortunes. Warburg traces the shift from representing patrons as pious figures to more powerful worldly individuals, as seen in Ghirlandaio's frescoes. He examines documents, letters, and testaments of the Florentine bankers to better understand the contexts and conditions surrounding their commissioned artworks. He never seriously considers the role of the artist as an individual or the formal properties of their work. The Olympic gods lived on from antiquity to the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, but in new guises. They were given planetary roles as astral divinities, mythology projected into the sky.
Ever since the passing of antiquity, the ancient gods have lived on in Christian Europe as cosmic spirits, religious forces with a strong influence in practical affairs. Indeed, the cosmology of the ancient world, notably in the form of astrology, undeniably survived as a parallel system, tacitly tolerated by the Christian Church. The astral deities were faithfully transmitted through a long migration from the Hellenistic world by way of Arabia, Spain and Italy to Germany. They lived on as time gods, mathematically defining and mythically ruling every chronological unit in the annual round. They were beings of sinister, ambivalent, and indeed contradictory powers. In attempting to elucidate the frescoes in the Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara, I hope to have shown how an iconological analysis that can range freely, with no fear of border guards, and can treat the ancient, medieval and modern worlds as a coherent historical unity. An analysis that can scrutinize the purest and the most utilitarian of arts as equivalent documents of expression how such a method can cast light on great and universal evolutionary processes in all their interconnectedness.
He was looking at all these astronomical and astrological treatises. He traces it back 6th century India, Egypt, Persia, medieval Latin, Renaissance. This is an extraordinary feat of, an approach that sees a cultural artifact and its global origins in their apparent entirety.
Albrecht Dürer was the most important artist of the Northern Renaissance. He introduced classical antiquity, both in its theories of proportion and in adopting its themes. In his study, Warburg focuses on the artist's drawing The Death of Orpheus, 1494, whose form, as well as its emotive force of gesture, derived from ancient Greece. It depicts the story of Orpheus being attacked and killed by the Maenads, the followers of Dionysus, the god of madness. Warburg is fascinated by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of two great strains in Greek culture: the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the rational and the irrational, the measured and the excessive.
Antiquity came to Dürer by way of Italian art, not merely as a Dionysian stimulant, but as a source of Apollonian clarity. Every age can see only those Olympic symbols that it can recognize and bear through the development of its own inner visual organs. We, for instance, were taught by Nietzsche a vision of Dionysos. Every age has the renaissance of antiquity it deserves. The true voice of antiquity, which the Renaissance knew well, chimes with the image. For the death of Orpheus was more than a studio motif of purely formal interest. It stood for the dark mystery play of Dionysian legend, passionately and knowingly experienced in the spirit and through the words of the ancients.
Warburg writes about Dürer's engraving, Melancholia I.
It had something to do with his cultural identity. This is an icon of German art. He was inspired by scholars before him who had begun to unearth Dürer's sources, which lay in this esoteric realm of pseudo-hieroglyphics. He sometimes equated scholarship with a certain kind of interest in hidden, lost, occult, arcane traditions. Then there must have been some sense that through the figure of the angel holding her cheek, inactive, with all the tools of her trade lying abandoned around her, that this was also a portrait of a melancholic, and maybe the portrait of Warburg himself as manic depressive. There was a side of melancholy influenced by the planet Saturn, which gave rise to flights of genius, have leaps of inspiration and leaps of depression, and that was the characteristic of the great artist.
The truly creative act, that which gives Dürer's Melancholia I its consoling, humanistic message of liberation from the fear of Saturn, can be understood only if we recognized that the artist has taken a magical and mythical logic and made it spiritual and intellectual. The malignant, child-devouring planetary god is humanized and metamorphosed by Dürer into the image of the thinking, working human being.
Warburg buys a villa at 114 Heilwigstrasse in 1909. His learning is now widely respected and his library increasingly consulted. He had become a Hamburg institution, taking a lively part in the city's cultural life. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Warburg becomes deeply distressed by Italy's break with Germany. And then, by the realization of the war's destructiveness and futility.
He was sort of fighting the war at home, and he did it by collecting materials. The whole family was involved in excerpting newspapers. For Warburg, this collection of materials relating to World War I had a huge, let's say, emotional value, which in the end triggered his psychosis. This is Warburg's collection of Zettelkästen. He started as a student to have these boxes. This collection of boxes reflects the whole spectrum of Warburg's interest, which have become the title of each box. This box is called Juden. Then comes Juden im Krieg, Jews and War. Very important topic he was working on also with his brother Max on an essay about the role of the Jewish kind of part of the German population during World War I. So this is the box called Kunst und Krieg 1915-1916. We come to this section, Kunst Hindenburg. Art, it will say, relating to Hindenburg. This is a label of a can of sardines. A typical example for Warburg's ongoing interest in how art was traceable throughout all genres, like from the highest to the lowest, the everyday object, but also kind of propaganda.
Warburg started during the First World War to develop his ideas on political iconography, his interest in propaganda, in political posters and images. He is a grandfather of this idea, and he did it very well, for he tried to understand why in a world of civilization the First World War began and people did hate each other in a way. It was like they would be new barbarians.
Progressively, as the war came to an end, he started to somehow have paranoid fantasies about how his family may become the target of reprisals. He thought that it would be better to commit suicide rather than having his family being murdered. He actually took out a revolver and threatened to kill his wife and children and himself. So that was the precipitating event again that led then to his first hospitalization in Hamburg.
A.B. Warburg is confined to various psychiatric clinics before coming under the care of Dr. Ludwig Binswanger, spending 1921 to 1924 in Bellevue Clinic in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland.
It was one of the facilities at the forefront of care in Europe at the time. Nijinsky and Kirchner maybe are the most famous other patients besides Warburg who spent time in Kreuzlingen. The diagnosis is schizophrenia. They all agree that this is a case that presents very limited potential for recovery. At the time, it was considered to be an irreversible hospitalization. We have a daily record of basically whatever happened, the outburst and the treatments, how much it was administered of a certain, again, pharmaceutical and so on. Warburg clearly does some pretty crazy things. He attacks the nurses, he starts shouting, he has to be restrained. He is quite aggressive. He does that uncontrollably at times. He has fantasies, he has hallucinations. For instance, he believes that the Binswangers have chopped his wife and children and parts of their bodies are scattered around the clinic park. His language is very mumbled, it doesn't make much sense. There are long transcriptions of a delirium in which he makes up words. You can't really tell what he's trying to say. Warburg keeps his journal and writes letters, but always in pencil. I think it was in part due to some representation that ink may be blood, or the pencil was perhaps also a less potentially dangerous tool to carry around.
Warburg is shaken by Jewish Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau's murder in 1922. He worries also about the use of anti-Semitic images.
His fantasies are clearly informed by a wave of violent anti-Semitism that is ongoing in Germany, that has direct relationships to his family. We know that there was an assassination attempt against his brother, and therefore he's capable, out of the life world in which he's living, to transform real dangers, which are specifically about him in his Jewish identity, into a set of persecution fantasies, which, when you look at it in retrospect, are eerily like prophecies.
At the beginning of 1923 is when Kraepelin is brought in. This happens at the bequest of a family. Kraepelin is at the time really the foremost authority in the field of psychiatry. He introduces this category of manic depressive, what now maybe we would call bipolar. It opened up the possibility of a recovery. It's no longer a matter of if he's going to be released, but when. Kraepelin advises the use of opium for a period, and this is something that excites Warburg. In his notes, there is always this, written under opium. Warburg writes fragments of his autobiography. This journey to the American Southwest somehow bringing to the fore again his real scholarly interest.
At the suggestion of Dr. Binswanger, to provide proof of his capacity to think clearly, Warburg prepares a lecture on his earlier work on the Hopi ritual of the serpent dance.
Warburg understood his sickness to be also related to his scholarly studies. They were both the cause, he felt, and the cure.
But now, in March 1923, in Kreuzlingen, in a sealed institution where I find myself a seismograph made of pieces of wood stemming from a growth transplanted from the Orient into the nourishing North German plain while carrying a branch inoculated in Italy, I allow the signals that I have received to be released from me, because in this epoch of a chaotic defeat, even the weakest one is beholden to strengthen the will to cosmic order. The confession of an incurable schizoid deposited into the archives of the doctors of the soul.
Before a select audience of patients, clinicians, and invited guests, A.B. Warburg delivers a masterful lecture on the Hopi serpent ritual, barely looking at his manuscript. The motto that preceded the lecture:
It is an old book to browse in Athens or Rybe, all cousins. They stand on middle ground between magic and logos, and their instrument of orientation is the symbol. Between a culture of touch and a culture of thought is the culture of symbolic connection. And for this stage of symbolic thought and content, the dances of the Pueblo Indians is exemplary. In this snake dance, the serpent is therefore not sacrificed, but rather through consecration and suggestive dance mimicry transformed into a messenger and dispatched so that, returned to the soul of the dead, it may in the form of lightning produce storms from the heavens. The elementary form of emotional release through Indian magical practice may strike the layman as a characteristic unique to primitive wildness, of which Europe knows nothing. And yet 2,000 years ago, in the very cradle of our European culture in Greece, cultic habits were in vogue which in crudeness and perversity far surpass what we have seen among the Indians. The idea of the serpent as a destroying form from the underworld has found its most powerful and tragic symbol in the myth and in the sculpted group of Laocoon. The soothsaying priest who wanted to come to the aid of his people, by warning them of the wiles of the Greeks, falls victim to the revenge of the partial gods. Thus, the death of the father and his sons becomes a symbol of ancient suffering. Death at the hands of vengeful demons, without justice and without hope of redemption. That is the hopeless, tragic pessimism of antiquity. The serpent as the demon in the pessimistic worldview of antiquity has a counterpart in a serpent deity in which we can at last recognize the human, transfigured beauty of the classical age. Asclepius, the ancient god of healing, carries a serpent coiling around his healing staff as a symbol. The snake also reveals how a body can leave its skin and yet continue to live. The capacity for bodily renewal make the snake the most natural symbol of immortality. These notes should not be taken as the pretended results of superior insights, let alone of science, but as the desperate confessions of a seeker after salvation.
There's a funny relationship between what he's talking about, namely the Hopi Indians doing this dangerous dance, and him doing the lecture about the dangerous dance, both of them being able to keep composure under the great condition of the greatest strain. And so whenever he's writing about the serpent and holding it in their mouths and the danger of that, he's also speaking, I think, about the action of the lecture, about coming forth of these words and being able to keep composed even with a gathered audience around him.
12 April 1924. I was able to speak freely for an hour and a half without losing my train of thought, and I was able to make a series of claims relating to the psychology of culture in close connection with my earlier research. My doctors saw in this lecture a very encouraging sign that my faculties of communication had been restored.
After 3.5 years, Warburg is released from the Kreuzlingen Clinic on the 12th of August 1924. Warburg returns to Hamburg. His library, under the direction of Fritz Sachsel, is now also a research institute. Warburg works with an architect, Gerhard Langmack, designing a new building for the library alongside his home. It contained some 46,000 volumes.
So we are sitting here in the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg, and this was created as a symbolic architecture. You can see a facade which is an expressionist, very modern facade, and this in a very well-off neighborhood of neoclassical homes. You have to bow your head under the inscription Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses, the goddess of memory. And then you come into a building which has 4 storage floors for the book collection. Starting with image, art and architecture. On the 2nd floor, you have orientation, philosophy, and religion. On the 3rd floor, you have word, language, and philology. And on the last, you have action. So the social life, the cultural history, was the climax of the architectural symbolism of this building.
Gertrude Bing, Warburg's research assistant and later director of the library, described its underlying principle, the law of good neighborliness.
The classification is anything but indifferent. The manner of shelving the books is meant to impart certain suggestions to the reader who, looking on the shelves for one book, is attracted by the kindred ones next to it, glances at the sections above and below, and finds himself involved in a new trend of thought which may lend to additional interest to the one he was pursuing. –
The room where we are sitting here right now, it's a famous reading room with a skylight which is of elliptical form. The ellipse for Warburg was a kind of symbol for his own personal life and for cultural history. The polarity of the two centers of an ellipse is a perfect metaphor for combining contradictions. In his manic depression, which he developed because of the First World War, when he had to focus the fact that history is not a linear development towards enlightenment, he could develop this idea of an ellipse in order to understand that there is a possibility to keep contradictions in a historical model for his life as well as for cultural history in general.
The fascination of Warburg also had something to do with his own unfinished, unresolved, but extremely suggestive work on memory. And that in the 20th century, with the catastrophic events, the ruptures that the 20th century brought, people who worked in the humanities found it very hard to figure out how to talk about history, about memory, about the long continuation of culture leading up to themselves. In his own biography and the way it relates to the traumas directly of the First World War, and I think most importantly, prophetically of the Holocaust, he becomes a figure who himself embodies the problems of memory and continuity.
There were two series of publications in Warburg's absence, lectures and studies, with essays by scholars whose fields were promoted by the Warburg Library. Drawing on the resources of the library, art historian Erwin Panofsky advanced the approach of iconology which Warburg was pioneering. Both he and philosopher Ernst Cassirer traced symbolic forms in their respective fields to learn how people made sense of the world. Warburg is productive in his last years, though his work was often fragmentary and unfinished. Though he published almost nothing, he gave lectures and planned with Fritz Sachsel an exhibition on the relationship between man and the cosmos. He writes to his brother Max,
13 June 1928. I shall never forget, as I've often said, that when I asked you for support in my struggle against state-sponsored German triumphalist exhibitionism, you and Father gave me unlimited moral support and splendid financial credit, although I was an unofficial, isolated, and unproven intellectual.
There's a photograph of the brothers. They're sitting or standing round a table, prosperous gentlemen, thumbs in their waistcoats and so on. Max and Aby at the table. At the very last minute, when it was too late for anybody to say no, Aby, who knew the significance of every gesture, puts out his hand like a beggar.
Starting in 1924, Warburg works on a project that later became his picture atlas, the title of which would be Mnemosune, subtitled
Image Sequence for the Cultural Study of Expressive Material Reminiscent of Antiquity in the Representation of Cosmic and Human Movements during the European Renaissance.
In his introduction, Warburg discusses the cosmology of images and signs, the difference between the religious and mathematical worldview, and between fantasy and rationality, among other subjects. He constantly rearranges the images on the panels.
Everything we live through is metamorphosis.
Warburg gets this idea that Mnemosyne, the mother of the muses, at the same time meaning memory, is a good title for the project. An atlas with images, certainly with a geographical connotation, cross cultures, cross history. It was a working tool, it was a laboratory demonstrating his ideas. all the projects Warburg had been working on throughout his life. In the end, he wanted a printed book, but it was a sequence of panels. He pinned photographs on which would explain the history of civilization in terms of expression. We have got 63 photographs of panels. We don't really know what would have been the number of panels and plates in the atlas he would have reached. Panel 46 is dedicated to the nympha, or to the female figures with a chest on her head, the motif which is common already in antiquity. Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who has written some sort of memory of a kind of 15th century Florentine woman, which Warburg wanted to include in his atlas as a document of the mentality of the time. It's also the role the woman takes on in allegories at the time. And then, of course, there's the element of the figure in motion.
He wanted to understand the world, and for him the idea of Atlas, carrying the globe on his shoulders, it was his idea of the work he had to do.
Not until art history can show that it sees the work of art in a few more dimensions than it has done so far will our activity again attract the interest of scholars and of the general public. Every serious scholar who has to venture on a problem of cultural history reads over the entrance to his workshop Goethe's lines. What you call the spirit of the age is really no more than the spirit of the worthy historian in which the age is reflected. In my role as psychohistorian, I try to diagnose the schizophrenia of Western civilization from its images in an autobiographical reflex. May the history of art and the study of religion, between which lies nothing at present but wasteland overgrown with verbiage, meet together one day in learned and lucid minds, and may they share a workbench in the laboratory of the iconological science of civilization.
A.B. Warburg died of a heart attack on the 26th of October, 1929, at the age of 63. At the time of his death, Warburg had not yet written the captions and commentaries he had intended for the atlas. The work remains unfinished.
Apart from Warburg's death, there was a very momentous event in that year, 1929, which was the Great Crash. The Warburg Bank in Hamburg was effectively made bankrupt and wiped out. So it could no longer continue to fund the institute. So it was just kind of drifting on in a very, very reduced way when the Nazis took power in January 1933. And as a Jewish institution, it almost immediately had to close its door to non-Jewish students and professors. Saxel, the director, lost his job in the University of Hamburg. Panofsky lost his job as well. And it then became obvious that there was nothing to do except to get it away somehow from Hamburg. While Vint and Saxel were in London, they got in touch with Lord Lee of Fareham, and through him with Samuel Courtauld, who had just established the Courtauld Institute as an art history institute of the University of London. And he decided to finance basically the institute in London.
60,000 books and equipment were shipped to London in December 1933 via barges that went down the Elbe River and up the Thames.
In 1944, after extensive negotiations with the Warburg family, who were intent above all on the institute retaining its independence, it was handed over in November to the University of London, and it's remained here ever since.
Warburg's library has always been seen as unique, and it is unique. We know from the first generation of users, a person like Francis Yates, who have been writing about and speaking about later on, how much the structure of the library has helped them in defining their topics and basically in their research, and how inspirational it was. And that we still find in lots of people who are using the library today and are supporters of this institution.
The aura of Warburg has grown enormously in the last 30 years, last 30, 40 years. To now he's a totemic figure in modern humanist culture.
We put Warburg along with Kafka, Freud, Wittgenstein, Benjamin. I mean, that's the group of people Warburg belongs to.
Warburg is as successful in the reception in his afterlife, he perhaps would say, because he looked over the borders of art history. An art history which no longer was only focused on Meisterwerke, on masterworks, and so it helped us to understand our daily life to pop history, music and everything.
The Warburg has to sort of now deal with all these aspects, the anthropological, the biological, and the potential for genuinely cross-cultural studies.
In a time when we use images everywhere, we need to understand them, we need to handle it. And here Warburg has an important impact. His way of taking seriously any form of image, any communication in and through images, is a legacy that has become more important today than maybe at its time when he was developing it.
To see images in these global contexts couldn't be more critical. I mean, when we think of the ways in which ISIS is not only using images for propaganda, to see a statue both of historic worth and of aesthetic value being so destroyed gives you a kind of visceral shock, because you feel it's not only the assault on our cultural heritage, but you feel the assault on the body. Those studies initiated by Warburg, that kind of philological and historical rigor actually provides us with tools, provides the humanities, not just the sciences, with tools to understanding how people behave with images and with bodies in our society.
When I look back on my life's journey, it seems that my function has been to serve as a seismograph of the soul, to be placed along the dividing lines between different cultural atmospheres and systems.